for this session, we are going to be talking about understanding the National Research Service Award, Fellowship and Training Grants. And joining us today to do the presentation will be Dennis Twombly, who's the Deputy Director and the Training Director at, the Training Director of the Office of Extramural Policy, as well as the Training Director at NICHD, as well as Lisa Moeller, who is a team leader in the Grants Administration branch at NIGMS. Just a couple of housekeeping items. If you can send us your questions via the Q&A feature chat, that would be great. Myself and Christina Fleming and Kelly Albrecht will be answering those as quickly as we can, and then we will be saving any questions for the presenters for the end of their presentation. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Dennis and Lisa.
Great, thanks, Shoshana. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to be giving this presentation, and I think we have a very large audience, and that's terrific. So in this presentation, I'm going to start off with an overview of the NRSA programs. I will be approaching it more from a programmatic standpoint, and just an overall summary of what these programs are, why we have them, who they're targeted for, and so forth. In the second part of the presentation, Lisa will talk about post-award issues. So what happens after a fellowship or a training grant is awarded. And so we're dividing it up that way. In the bullets down there at the bottom, you see I'll be talking about NRSA programs in general, and those are eligibility and general requirements that pertain to both fellowships and institutional training grants. And then I'll break those two apart so that you can see how those function. And then the last two bullets are for Lisa's section of the presentation. We have a pretty long slide set here. We will buzz through some of these and skip them, but we wanted to have a comprehensive enough slide set so that if you have that as a resource, you'll be able to go through the set and see pretty much everything that's kind of most important about these programs, even if we don't talk about it. All right, so what are NRSA programs? So these are ways that NIH uses to support the training of pre-docs, postdocs, sometimes new investigators. And the idea is to give them training with mentors who are successful scientists and help bring them along the training pipeline. Each of the NIH institutes has a group of fellowships and training grants that they provide support for, but it's important to know that when you submit an application, it has to fit the mission and priorities of the institute that you're applying to. So if you put something together that's more in the cancer realm and you submit the application and it comes to NICHD, we won't fund it. We have a process for referring applications back and forth once they come in the front door, but it's in your interest to figure out which institute might be more interested in a particular type of application. Here we have a slide of the training and career pipeline. The panel in the middle, the orange panel, starts with graduate students and medical students as they begin research training, moving on toward postdoctoral training after somebody receives their doctoral degree, and then moving on towards faculty stages. We have different types of awards at NIH to target different groups of individuals and different stages of training. Some people may end up having multiple awards. They might have a pre-doctoral fellowship and then a postdoctoral fellowship, or they may just have one. We don't expect any one person to have all of these, but we provide support for these particular stages here. What I'll be talking about today are the ones here in orange. These are the fellowships and career awards. I'm sorry, these are the fellowships and training grants. After that, somebody might consider these other ones. Overall, then, what we're trying to do is bring people to the point where they can apply for research grants when they get their own laboratory or maybe are collaborating with other people as a research team. Individual postdoctoral fellowships include, for example, the F30 and the F31 predoctoral fellowships, and also the individual postdoctoral fellowships, the F32s. There are subdivisions of these, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But basically, these are applications that a fellow would put together in partnership with their mentor to propose a research project and a training program to support them while they're either in graduate school or as a postdoctoral fellow. So these are individual awards. In contrast, the institutional training grants are awards that are made to an institution, and the funds that are provided have enough support for multiple slots, either multiple predoctoral or postdoctoral slots, or a combination of the two. And they are administered under the direction of a training director who's usually a very well-established investigator. And there's a team of faculty mentors where the trainees can be farmed out for training in those laboratories. Eligibility, this applies to all of the fellowships and training grants. So all the people who are supported on these programs have to be US citizens or permanent residents. The degree requirements are pretty obvious for pre-docs. They must have a baccalaureate degree and be enrolled in a doctoral program of some kind. This could be a single degree program or a dual degree program, such as an MD, PhD program. And we'll talk about the F30 awards in a second. For postdoctoral fellowships, the F32, they need to have some kind of a doctoral degree, such as PhD or MD or a comparable doctoral degree from a domestic reform institution. The NRSA awards have limits of support. For predoctoral fellowships, the limit is 5 years of support. If someone is in a formal dual degree program, the limit is 6 years and not 5 years. An example is MD, PhD. Postdoctoral fellowships are limited to 3 years of support. So those limits apply to any combination of individual and or institutional awards. So if somebody is on a T32 for 3 years as a predoctoral fellow, they only have 2 more years of individual fellowship support available to them. So but the aggregate limits do not apply to predoc plus postdoc. So these are separate limits for those 2 stages of training. We do have some exceptions that aren't really very common, but we do have those. And in those cases, you need to contact the funding institution. Time commitment, we require full-time training. That's defined as 40 hours per week devoted to research training activity. There are some provisions that you'll find in the grants policy statement about part-time training, but those are not very common and they're only approved under certain conditions, which we'll see here. So medical conditions, disability, family situations, and so on. Importantly, we don't allow part-time training to accommodate other sources of funding or job opportunities or clinical practice. The awards for training support, either fellowships or training grant slots, include a stipend, which is a subsistence allowance to help defray living expenses. Tuition and fees. So in an application, you need to put the full needs, the full costs at your institution, but NIH has a formula which caps the amount that we really do award. So the formula is 60% of the actual costs up to a cap of $16,000 for predoctoral trainees and fellows, and $21,000 for those in dual degree programs. And for postdocs, it's $4,500. For T32 programs and other institutional training grants, training related expenses can be used for health insurance, staff, consultants, research supplies. I should have included here also institutional allowance because it covers the same kinds of costs I think a lot of fellows and trainees now use a lot of these funds for health insurance just because those costs are so high. The way to find out the current support levels, I used to have a couple of slides on what the levels were, but I got tired of updating it every year. So just Google search NRSA stipends 2022, and that will show you the current allowance for stipends, tuition fees, institutional allowance, and training related expenses. And there are pretty much changes every year. So check it out before you do the budget on the application. Individual NRSA fellowships. So these are the F series, and here are some of the ones that we see most often. For pre-doctoral fellowships, there are F30s in dual degree programs, students in dual degree programs. There are two types of these that you need to pay attention to, and you may have come across this already. And that is, there's one fellowship announcement that's for individuals and institutions with MSTP programs. So those are medical science training program funding. NIGMS supports a lot of MSTP programs. Lisa can maybe comment on that. And then there's a separate funding opportunity for institutions without MSTP program. You need to pay attention to which is which and submit the right kind of application. F31 fellowships are for predoctoral students. Most of those come in under the so-called parent funding opportunity announcement. We also have an F31 opportunity for those who are underrepresented in science, so underrepresented racial and ethnic minorities, people with disabilities, or people from a disadvantaged background. Those categories are defined in the funding opportunity announcement. You can look that up. Postdoctoral fellowships. Postdoctoral fellowships, the F32 is the one we see almost all the time. And then there's a senior F33 fellowship that isn't really used very often these days, but it is available through some institutes. So how do you find out about these programs? You need to go to the so-called funding opportunity announcement. So you'll hear us talk about FOAs this, FOAs that. That's a broader umbrella term covering PAs and sometimes RFAs. But this document, which can run anywhere from 20 to 30 to 40 pages long, and is very detailed, very specific, gives you everything you need to know about a particular program. So at the top is the title. This one I've taken from the parent F32 announcement. And here's the PA number for that. And right under these sections, you see components of participating organizations. So these are the institutes and centers, the ICs, at NIH that support that program. So if you don't see NICHD or NCI or some other institute listed here, you should not be applying to them because they won't provide any money through that program. And some institutes do not participate in some of these, depending upon, but most of the institutes participate in the ones that I'm going to be talking about. And the requirements are quite similar, although there's some subtle differences from institute to institute. And where you find out about that is this section right here at the bottom. It says special note, not all institutes and centers participate in the parent announcements. You should carefully note which ICs participate and view their respective research areas of research interest and requirements at the, and this is the key thing, we'll call these IC tables, the table of IC specific information requirements and staff contact. So if you click on this link, it will take you to a big long table that looks a lot like this, only this is just the NICHD entry on a table of probably 20 institutes. This is what you really need to go to find out what are the kind of custom parameters that those institutes require for those applications, whether they're fellowships or whether they're 232 programs. So here you see in the main text box, our NICHD entry describes, what is our mission all about? What kinds of science do we study at our institute? And these are the things that we're trying to cultivate a workforce in. Okay? That's our objective. We also have some other guidance here about who's eligible, who's not eligible. We have listing here for the amount of salary support that we might provide, and so on. This is taken from a K99. I didn't bother to switch to another funding opportunity just because I could show you the example here. For the F awards and for the T32s, you'll find all of the current cost allowances in the notice that's released each year. So if you Google stipend allowance NIH 2022, you'll get the current amount. But the point is that most institutes will put some budgetary limits here in this table. And then on the left side, you see who you should be contacting in case you have questions. So there will be a scientific program contact. It could be a program officer, it could be a training director such as myself. And then there's also a grants management contact. Ryan Talisnick is in our grants management branch. If you go to the NIGMS entry, you'll see Lisa's name or somebody else's name from NIGMS. Those are the people you can get in touch with right at the very beginning and start asking questions. How do you apply? You go to the SF424 application guide and find the F category here. Just click on that and you'll go to the PDF and you'll get all of the instructions for fellowships. One thing to note about that, some people ask, well, should I be following the instructions in the 424 guide or should I be following the instructions in the funding opportunity? The basic rule is that the 424 guide has kind of the basic instructions. However, the funding opportunity sometimes has superseding instructions that you should follow rather than the 424 guide. But if the FOA doesn't say anything about something, you follow the 424 instructions. Review and award for fellowships. We have a two-stage review. So the initial review is usually done by the Center for Scientific Review, CSR Fellowship Study Sections. You can Google search CSR Fellowship Study Sections. You'll get a sizable list, and you'll be able to see what types of science is appropriate for those study sections. Some of the institutes, I can't come up with specific examples right off the top of my head, but some of the ISDs review applications in-house rather than at CSR. NICHD uses CSR for all of ours. There's a second level review, which is analogous to council. Most of the institutes have an administrative training group, some kind of a group that does the second level review of fellowship. As far as time frame, there's generally a 9-month period from receipt of an application to when an award might start. The exception is for October Council when we often don't have a federal budget or there's other uncertainties about how much money an institute might have to distribute out for fellowship. Review criteria for fellowships. I won't belabor this, but they're all in the funding opportunity announcement. But basically, who's the fellowship? What's the quality of the fellowship applicant, the fellow? How experienced are the mentors and the sponsor? Is there an effective research training plan? What's the potential for training this individual? And is there a strong institutional commitment to this fellow? There's other review criteria as well. Under each one of these score criteria in the FOA, you will see a paragraph listing a bunch of questions that reviewers will ask about the application. And that's how they come up with the final score. For institutional training grants, I think I described these before. So it's award to an institution. They have slots to support pre-docs and postdocs. And the review really focuses more on, is this a strong institution? Is there a strong training program, strong opportunities for trainees to learn to do research with those mentors? I won't read through this, but there are reasons why we do these T32 programs. These are really oriented around specific themes for, it could be research on autism or research on medical rehabilitation or something like that, where the principal investigator will put together mentors who complement each other and contribute to that theme. And so in the end, the trainees are receiving a well-rounded training experience and then can do individualized work with those mentors. Preparing a T32 application, again, you go through the 424 application guide. These all need to be domestic institutions. And as I said before, training must fall within the mission of the awarding institute. So you can either go to funding opportunity, look up that IC table, or get in touch with the training officer or program staff and just say, I'm thinking about putting together a T32 in the following area. Is this something that your institute would be interested in? A couple of things I need to point out about the application due dates. The standard dates for institutional training are January 25th, May 25th, and September, but some institutes don't follow that schedule. So you need to look at the FOA. Some institutes use only May 25th. Some have different dates for new versus resubmission. Some are for AIDS or non-AIDS, and so on. So you really need to check out the requirements beforehand. Review, it's a two-stage review. Again, some institutes have a single study section. Other institutes use topic-based study sections. Review criteria, it's really oriented more toward the environment and opportunities for training. You can look at these in the slide set that will be archived either now already or after the talk. So that brings my section to a close. I'll turn it over now to Lisa, and she will talk about what happens once the dog catches the bumper, once you get funded for your fellowship or training. Lisa?
Hi, everyone. Dennis, can you advance the slide? I'm going to be talking to you about fellowships first, and then later on I'll talk more about training grants. Some of the policies and procedures for both training grants and fellows are the same, and I'll let you know which ones that applies to as we move along. Next slide. So once an awarding IC has notified the fellow or the institution that they intend to make a fellowship award, and they've gotten all the documentation that they need, they'll issue a fellowship notice of award. A fellowship notice of award is very similar to a NOA that you would get for a research grant, except that on the front page, there is a date that is 6 months from the issue date of the notice of award. Next slide. The reason for this is that the fellow has up to 6 months to activate that fellowship. In order to activate the fellowship, you need to look at the terms and conditions of the award, of the notice of award, and you'll see an indication of where you should submit the activation notice. Most of these are being emailed since the pandemic. So the activation notice has to be submitted to that IC where they indicate in the terms and condition. And if they are a postdoctoral trainee in their initial 12 months of NRSA postdoc support, they also had to submit a payback agreement. Nobody else has to submit the payback agreement except for the postdocs in their first 12 months of NRSA support. Now, once the fellowship has ended, they should submit the termination notice within 30 days. And the termination notice is submitted through Xtrain. Next. So both your fellows on fellowships and trainees on institutional training grants can have their stipends supplemented, but the institution should have a written, formally established policy about supplementation. And the policy should be the same regardless of the training status. Or excuse me, it should be the same for similar training status, but it should be consistent regardless of the funding source. So if the trainee is funded by non-federal funds, the stipend supplementation should be the same as somebody who's being paid by federal funds. And the supplementation cannot cause additional obligations for the trainee or the fellow, or cause the NRSA training grant or fellowship to be prolonged. Next. So you can also, the trainee can also receive compensation. Compensation is totally different than supplementation because compensation is a part-time job. There's an employer-employee relationship. So it's like a part-time job, like a teaching assistant or a lab assistant. It's just like any other part-time job, like a part-time retail job or working at the Taco Bell. Compensation is salary. It's not stipend supplementation. You can get compensation on an NIH research grant, but that NIH research grant has to have a science that is totally separate and apart from the training experience. It cannot be similar. And NIH considers a part-time basis 25% of your full-time, or about 10 hours a week. If you are going to work part to receive compensation from working on a NIH grant, the fellow does have to receive approval from the fellow sponsor. And if you're on a training grant, the training grant PI has to approve of it. And again, it can, the compensation cannot prolong the NRSA experience. Next. So the fellowships do have to submit an annual RPPR, and that is submitted through the ERA Commons. They don't have to submit a separate final progress report. Instead, when they submit the termination notice through Xtrain, on the termination notice in box 8, they can summarize their progress report there. You also don't have to submit an FFR for fellowships, except for when you use the FFR form to submit your federal cash transaction to PMS. Next. There are some reasons for getting a NIH prior approval. One is if the fellow's sponsor changes, or if the sponsor is going to be absent for more than 3 months. In that case, you'll want to assign an interim sponsor, but both of those require NIH prior approval. You also need prior approval if you're going to change the institution, or if there's going to be a change to the proposed area of research that has already been approved. If all 3 of these things change, then we'll probably ask you to resubmit a new fellowship application. Next. I'm going to skip this, but it's here for you to refer to if you want to find out information about our leave policies for fellows and trainees. Next. And now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about institutional training grants. Next slide. So for institutional training grants, on or before the time that you appoint a trainee, you have to submit an appointment form. Could everybody make sure that their microphones are muted? We're hearing some background noise. Thank you. The appointment forms are submitted through Xtrain on or before the appointment begins. And then once the appointment ends, you submit the termination notice through Xtrain. Next. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as Dennis mentioned, the trainees are appointed on a full-time basis, and we usually define that as 40 hours a week. The appointments can be anywhere from 9 to 12 months in duration, and they can be appointed at any point during the budget period for a full 12 months. If you're going to appoint somebody for less than 9 months, you have to get NIH prior approval. Next. So many of our ICs adhere to the concept of training slots versus training months. What do I mean by that? Well, at NIGMS, where I work, we adhere to the concept of training months. So that means if we give you a notice of award and you see on there that we've awarded you 3 FTTPs, which stands for full-time training positions, or that's 3 trainees or 3 slots. They all mean the same thing. We interpret that as 36 training months because 3 trainees times 12 months equals 36 training months. So what that means is if you receive that notice of award and you appoint 3 trainees for 12 months each, and one trainee comes to you after 3 months and they say, you know, I thought research was my passion, but it's not a good fit for me and I need to terminate early. In that case, you'll have 9 unused training months. So NIGMS would allow you to appoint a 4th trainee to utilize those 9 unused months. Now, we include a term of award on the notice of award, like the one that you see at the bottom of your screen, and we encourage all of the other ICs to do so as well. But in the absence of this, you should reach out to the grants management specialist that awarded the notice of award to ask what you can do, because some ICs who adhere to the concept of training slots, in the example that I gave, would say, well, I'm sorry that one person terminated early, but we're only going to allow you to appoint 3 trainees, and you'll have to indicate on the FFR the funds that are associated with that early termination under unobligated funds. The reason for that is that they're going to use those unobligated funds to fund their training programs in the future. Not all ICs have large training grant budgets, and some find it necessary to utilize this method in order to fund their training grants in the future. Next. So I mentioned that you can appoint somebody at any time during the budget year, even on the last day, for up to 12 months. But if you do that, you'll create something that we call an overlapping appointment. So in this example, the trainee is appointed in budget year 1 on August 1st, 2018 for a full 12 months. That means the last 3 months overlaps into budget year 2. So what will happen is that whole 12-month appointment still belongs to budget year 1 because August 1st, the first day of that appointment, lands on during the budget period of budget year 1. But on the FFR for budget year 1, you will indicate under the unliquidated obligations line the stipend and tuitions associated with the 3 months that overlapped into budget year 2. That's because the stipend and tuition is really obligated at the point that that trainee is appointed. So it's, even though it didn't get expensed in year 1, it is truly obligated, and it should be listed under the unliquidated obligations. Next. So I'm going to skip this slide, but you can refer to it later regarding the allowable and unallowable costs on training grants. Next. Training grants do have to submit an RPPR annually. The due dates vary. NIGMS requires annual RPPRs to be submitted on November 15th, even though we award most of our awards for training grants on July 1st. Other ICs adhere to the 2 months prior to the next budget period. So check your terms and conditions or the IC website if you aren't sure when that progress report is due. You do have to submit an interim RPPR if you're submitting a type 2 renewal. If we don't fund the type 2 renewal, that interim RPPR then becomes your final RPPR. And of course, if you don't submit a type 2 renewal, you have to submit a final RPPR 120 days after the project period. Next. FFRs are due annually for training grants. They're due 90 days after the end of the calendar quarter in which the period, project period ends. Next. You do need prior approval if you're going to have a change of PI. for certain types of rebudgeting, which I'll go over in the next slide. If you're going to replace an early termed trainee in some cases, as I had mentioned before, and in some, for some ICs, they issue a notice of award that will fund both pre-docs and postdocs. If you're going to substitute a pre-doc for a postdoc or vice versa, I would get that in writing from the grants management specialist of that IC. If you're going to have unpaid leave for a trainee leave of absence, that's a prior approval request. And if you're going to exceed the NRSA limits. Next. For rebudgeting, you can rebudget between stipends and tuition and fees without NIH prior approval, but you cannot rebudget stipend and tuition and fees into trainee travel and training related expenses. That requires prior approval. You can, however, rebudget trainee travel and trainee related expenses into any category that you would like. Next. You can, of course, have a first 12-month no-cost extension. You request it just like you do your other grants through ERA Commons. However, during that no-cost extension period, most ICs will not allow you to appoint a new trainee. You can, however, reappoint trainees who were on the grant in a previous 12-month period. Next. Okay, the next few slides are resources, and I want to remind you that you can stop by our IC individual booth or ask the training officer booth if you have additional questions. And I think we're going to open it up now to questions from the group for the last 5 minutes that we have.
Super. Hopefully I have learned, and it does look like I was able to push some questions to you and Dennis. There are probably more than you're able to pick and to answer. But well, first, are you seeing any of those on your screen, Dennis or Lisa?
In dismissed?
Yes.
I am, yes.
Okay. So again, I suspect that there are more than you will be able to, but I tried to pick, or we tried to pick a few questions that we were seeing sort of consistently asked. There were certainly a lot of questions about the childcare costs and how and when to request those. And there were probably at least 3 or 4 questions related to, I have an MD, do I count as a pre-doc or a postdoc? Those were a couple of questions that we pushed through.
Okay.
So we had a lot of questions at the booths too about the childcare costs. Can you just quickly review, like for fellowships that we did last
Absolutely.
year? T32 provisions.
Yes. I would be happy to. So for it's different for both the NRSA fellowships and the training grants, and there's a separate announcement for each. I encourage you to read those announcements because they have a link to FAQs, and the FAQs are phenomenal. So for fellowships, we'll offer you $2,500 per budget period for childcare provided by a licensed provider. And that can be used for children under the age of 13 or an individual with a disability under the age of 18. And to apply for that, you can either apply for it when you submit a new application, when you submit your type 5, or through an administrative type 3. For the training grants, as of fiscal year 2022, which is the fiscal year we are in, when we issue a competing T30 training grant or a type 5 training grant, we're automatically going to give you $2,500 per trainee. So you don't really have to do anything for your training awards. Now, if you don't utilize the $2,500 for each trainee, you can't rebudget that. You've got to show that on your FFR as an unobligated obligation. You can't rebudget those funds.
Okay, let me deal real quickly with this one. Let me just read it. If I'm qualified for a diversity supplement, then what is the benefit of applying for F31 Diversity versus F31 traditional route? Okay, so there's a couple of things mixed in here. So Diversity Supplement Program is different from the F31 Diversity Fellowship Program. So a supplement is an award to somebody, an investigator who already has an R01 grant, for example, where the supplement will allow that PI to bring on an underrepresented person to work in the laboratory and receive training. The F31 Diversity and the parent F31 are submitted applications on the fellow will prepare them and submit them through themselves through the sponsored programs office. So yes, I did mention we have the F31 Diversity versus the F31 parent. I think why you would apply for one versus another would depend on which institute is involved. We have had a flood of parent F31 applications over the years, and we're getting more and more each year. We've at NICHD tried very hard to keep the success rate about the same for the diversity F31 over the years. And for a while, the parent F31 success rate was much lower. I think now we're closer to the mid-20s on the parent F31 and more like 30 for the diversity F31. So if you came to NICHD, you'd be better off applying for the diversity F31 rather than the parent. But what you should do is contact the training officer and have them weigh in and give you an opinion on that.
Dennis, can I also just jump in quickly and correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't one potential difference also where you are in your dissertation defense stage? So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the F31 requires that you have already defended your dissertation, and I think the F31 Diversity does not. Is that right?
So good question. I have heard that question. Some people interpret that very literally. I think many institutes go by the FOA guidance that says apply as soon as you have started working in your PhD dissertation laboratory and are in position to develop a successful training program and research project. At our institute, you don't have to advance to candidacy, because for any of you who are out in academia, you know that some fellows or some graduate students often don't really advance to candidacy until quite late in the game. They haven't done their oral exams or done other things to advance to candidacy. So from our perspective, we want to get the money into the hands of that fellowship applicant as soon as possible. So I don't think, Lisa can maybe weigh in on this, but we don't apply that rule to the candidacy.
That's helpful, thank you. We have about 2 more minutes. If there's time, maybe for one question in the.
So Lisa, I like this one here because it's very confusing, and we get this question all the time. This is from, I guess, 3:17 p.m. Some ICs don't allow T32 PIs to use leftover funds for a new postdoctoral candidate. For example, if a trainee leaves early, the funds are forfeited. Is there any uniform guidance on how leftover funds can be used?
I'd be happy to answer that. Unfortunately, there isn't any uniform guidance. Each IC handles that differently. And that goes back to that slide about training months versus training slots. But I can give you an idea of why there's such a difference amongst the ICs. And it's really dependent on our budgets. NIGMS funds the lion's share of training grants. So we want to utilize up as much of those training slots as possible. So we have a much more liberal, flexible plan for trainees. However, some ICs don't even have a line item budget to fund training grants. So they are likely to need those leftover funds to fund their program in the years going forward. They count on those unobligated funds when a trainee terminates early, or if you weren't able to find somebody to fill a slot. So that is why it isn't uniform from IC to IC. It has a lot to do with budget, and it also has to do with the number of grants that the IC has to monitor and fund.
Good. So with that, I think we're at time. Really want to take this opportunity to thank Dennis and Lisa, the organizers. Thanks also to Kelly and Christina for helping to answer some of the questions. We realize we did not get to all of them. So please come find us at our IC booths, at the centralized booths, and we would be really happy to talk you through some of them. So with that, thank you.